Next, from the Union League Club of Chicago, we hear political scientists from the University of Virginia and Northwestern University discuss the lasting impact of the election of 1912, when Theodore Roosevelt ran as a third-party candidate. We'll hear how the issues Roosevelt raised in that campaign became part of the Democratic Party's platform 20 years later. This runs about 1 hour and 10 minutes.
I'd like to say good morning and welcome you to my favorite part of the TRA's annual meeting, symposium, discussion by writers and historians about Theodore Roosevelt and his times. The theme of the 2012 symposium is the appearance of the Progressive Party in the 1912 presidential campaign with Theodore Roosevelt as its standard bearer. The convention at which he was nominated was held here in Chicago 100 years ago and would not have taken place had Roosevelt been able to snatch the Republican nomination from President Taft, Roosevelt's choice for the White House 4 years earlier, and the current president. In a real sense, regardless of the existence of a progressive movement before 1912, the Progressive Party was a consequence of the decision of the Republican convention to renominate President Taft. Before 1912, delegates to both the Republican and Democrat conventions were mostly selected by the parties at state conventions. Roosevelt knew these would be controlled by the Taft forces. To win, he had to gather delegates in a different way, one not only beyond the hold of President Taft and Republican regulars, but one well suited to the progressive philosophy of eliminating intermediate institutions between those seeking public office and those electing them to public office. The direct presidential primary, something Roosevelt flirted with before he got into the 1912 race, fit this need. Not only would this eliminate state conventions as the go-between between voters and the nomination, it would advance the progressive preference for candidate-centered campaigns. To win primaries, candidates would have to go on the stump and not incidentally, something very amenable to Roosevelt and his style of campaigning with the people, but crippling both to Taft and Roosevelt's only nomination opponent from the progressive wing of the Republican Party, Senator Robert La Follette of Wisconsin. Roosevelt made the direct primary an issue in the fight for the nomination. La Follette soon fell away, and the contest settled for the Republican nomination into the Taft-Roosevelt battle that most treatments of the 1912 Republican Convention will discuss. As an aside from the 1912 presidential campaign as a whole, Taft, Roosevelt, Wilson, and to a lesser extent Eugene V. Debs, the Socialist Party candidate, are usually the only players remembered. But La Follette's role should not be completely ignored. Sadly for him, and for complete accounts of history, he may be the forgotten man of 1912. There were primaries in 1912 in only 12 states, 6 of which were because of Roosevelt pushing the direct primary idea. But they were big states, and they could yield a large bounty of delegates that could make things interesting for the Republicans. Alas for Roosevelt, when he cultivated enough delegates through these primaries to come close, it was not enough to win the nomination. Plan B was put into effect, contesting Taft delegates before they could be seated, in the hope of disqualifying enough so that Roosevelt delegates could take their place. This also was unsuccessful. But to fight this battle, he ignored the precedent that candidates did not come to conventions. Roosevelt came to Chicago to direct the effort personally. But as I say, it was doomed, and I think he must have known it. The more he promoted the cause of presidential primaries, the more he threatened the old guard and their control of the party, and the more they were determined to stop him. They and President Taft tightly controlled the convention, just as Roosevelt did 4 years earlier when he was president, and the Roosevelt effort failed. President Taft was renominated, and a few weeks later, a new political party, the Progressive Party, held its nominating convention here in Chicago. To nominate Roosevelt, in the general election, though he won more votes than Taft, and though he and Taft together won 1.2 million votes more than the Democrat Woodrow Wilson, Wilson won more than either of them and was elected president. So in 1912, Roosevelt's efforts to win the presidency were unsuccessful. He was not the winner. But some historians believe that in 1912, Roosevelt was playing a long game. That is, he was looking beyond the election to the future when the programs of the Progressive Party would become part of the American scheme of government and the American way of life. Our first speaker this morning, Professor Sidney Milkis, has written, "Out of the Republican convention came the Progressive Party." Perhaps in playing his long game, maybe that was Roosevelt's short-term goal all along. Professor Milkis, our first speaker, is from the University of Virginia and will discuss the constitutional debate that developed between Roosevelt and Taft in the campaign. Professor Milkis.
Morning, everybody. Are you guys good morning people? I'm not. I shall not be responsible for anything I say hereafter. Now, we've gathered in Chicago, not just because it's the 100th anniversary of the Progressive Party Convention, but also because the 1912 election was truly transformational and reverberates powerfully through our own political time. The 1912 presidential election was one of these rare campaigns that we have in American political history that challenged voters to think about their rights and the Constitution, that verged on political philosophy. It was the climactic battle of the progressive era that arose at the dawn of the 20th century when the country first tried to come to terms with the profound challenges that were raised by the Industrial Revolution. And just as our leaders today struggle to come to terms with the challenges of the global economy, so our leaders in 1912 struggled to come to terms with the gale storm of the Industrial Revolution. The election showcased 4 impressive candidates who really engaged in a remarkable debate about the future of American politics. In particular, each tried to grapple with the emergence of corporations, the trusts, as reformers dubbed them, who embodied a concentration of economic power that posed fundamental challenges to the foundations of the decentralized republic of the 19th century, which Harry just indicated was dominated by the localized party system. Once celebrated as the pillars of a grassroots politics that nurtured an active and competent citizenry, the Democratic and Republican parties now seem to be overwhelmed and corrupted, as Theodore Roosevelt put it in a colorful phrase, by the malefactors of great wealth. Eugene Debs, the popular socialist candidate, when socialism was at high tide in America, and the Democratic candidate, Woodrow Wilson, the former president of Princeton and former New Jersey governor who was elected president in 1912, contributed significantly to the constitutional debate over how to reform or humanize what Mark Twain called the Gilded Age. But there's a real sense in which the most important exchange was between T.R., the celebrated ex-president who bolted from the Republican Party and ran as the standard bearer of the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose campaign, as he famously called it, and William Howard Taft, the beleaguered Republican incumbent president who was the target of TR's insurgency. Roosevelt's Bull Moose campaign was especially important in setting the tone of the 1912 election, in ensuring that the presidential contest registered and inspired fundamental changes in American politics. The party was joined by an array of crusading reformers who viewed Roosevelt's campaign as their best hope to advance a program of national transformation. With the formidable Roosevelt still the most important figure of his age, the Progressive Party won over 27% of the popular vote and 88 electoral votes, including important states like California and Pennsylvania. No third-party candidate for the presidency has ever received such a large percentage of the popular vote, or as many electoral votes as the Progressive Party did in 1912. In fact, here's a counterfactual for you. I believe that had the Democrats not responded to the excitement aroused by the Bull Moose campaign and nominated their own progressive candidate, and it took 46 ballots for Wilson to get the nomination at the Democratic Convention in Baltimore, then Roosevelt might have been elected to a third term in 1912 as the head of the party dedicated in 1912 to making America over. Now, once the Democrats nominated Wilson, who posed as a more moderate reformer than TR claimed to be, Roosevelt and his followers knew their chances of victory were slim. The Democratic Convention took place in June, but when the progressives met in August, although they didn't think they had much of a chance to win, they met with great excitement. There was and great emotional fervor. Like a lot of insurgent movements in American history, the progressives were sustained by their moral, and in fact, you should call it religious fervor. This is what sustained them. Many of them were inspired by the social gospel movement, whose members viewed the Progressive Party as a political expression of their commitment to promote Christian social action on earth. They were kind of an evangelicalism of the left. At the Progressive Party convention, progressive delegates frequently sang the battle hymn of the Republic. They also frequently broke out into "Onward, Christian Soldiers." The religious fervor was so strong that the Jewish Oscar Strauss, the progressive governor, the progressive candidate for governor of New York, was seen singing "Onward, Christian Soldiers" with great fervor. Roosevelt himself, until this time, a very ardent but pragmatic and secular reformer during his presidency, stated the progressive cause with evangelical fervor. He spoke evangelicalism for the first time. "We stand at Armageddon," Roosevelt told those who followed him out of the Republican convention, "and we battle for the Lord." I always feel so empowered when I say those words. Academics rarely get to feel so empowered. He would repeat those words in his confession of faith at the Progressive Party convention, and David's going to tell us about that speech. Now, those of you who know your scriptures know that term, those words come from the book of Revelations. Armageddon is the place where the Messiah will return and defeat the Antichrist in the final battle between good and evil. Roosevelt established high stakes in this campaign. So trumpeted as the final resolution of the age-old conflict between private wealth and commonwealth, Roosevelt's moral crusade for progressive democracy was perhaps the most radical campaign ever undertaken by a major American political figure. It was rooted in the belief that localized parties, a bulwark of limited constitutional government, and an impediment to the development of a strong national government and presidency, simply could not cope with the realities of the 20th century, of the 20th century industrial order. This was a state of court and parties, because the shackles that the parties placed on national government and the president were codified by the judiciary, that struck down economic regulations that presumed to curb the worst abuses of big business and presumed to protect as violations that exploited workers in plants and manufacturing places of manufacture. The courts were intent upon protecting natural rights, which they defined as property rights. And the most notorious case at this time, and this was in no small part what animated many of the progressive causes, was the Lochner case, which was decided in 1905. It prohibited, even in the states, in this case New York State, government from limiting the hours that bakers could work on the grounds that such codes violated the 14th Amendment right of due process. That case, that fervent defense of the right of property, well illustrated, progressives claimed, how a natural rights understanding of constitutionalism relegated the country to a horse and buggy understanding of rights. That law would have limited bakers to working 10 hours a day and 60 hours a week. Progressives hardly thought that was paternalistic. They believed that only federal power, a new nationalism, as Roosevelt called it, in the form of regulatory bodies and laws, could match the power of corporations and trusts. Our aim, Roosevelt argued, should be to make the United States as far as possible, not merely apolitical, but also an industrial democracy. Now, like a lot of third parties in American history, the Progressive Party itself would have a brief life. When TR refused to run again in 1916, he doomed the third party to the dustbin of history. Still, a lot of the causes that were codified in the platform of the Progressive Party, that were crafted in the National Convention here in Chicago, would endure. The platform was sanctified as a covenant with the people of the United States. It was not, as a lot of historians and political scientists assert, merely an extension of TR's ambition, as great as that ambition was. Rather, it was a collective effort. It was the culmination of a concerted, programmatic effort that began 3 years before by those at the vanguard of the progressive movement. One that included many reformers who stood behind Roosevelt in critical ways to make the Progressive Party Progressive Party campaign such an important one. For example, Jane Addams, the famous suffragette and settlement house reformer. Other than TR, she was the most progressive, the most famous progressive. She worked on the platform, along with other notable progressive reformers. Among its planks were proposals that championed national regulations and social welfare that would not be enacted until the New Deal. There are striking parallels between the 1912 Progressive Party platform and the 1936 Democratic platform. The 1936 Democratic platform echoed the Progressive Party platform's call for restraints on financial markets and a program of Social Security. In fact, with respect to certain measures, most notably national health insurance, the Progressive Party prescribed commitments that remained unfulfilled until the dawn of the 21st century, until the dawn of our own time. President Obama has frequently pointed out that Roosevelt was the first president to champion a national health care plan. But this didn't happen during TR's presidency, when his reform ambitions were far more modest, when he was defending a square deal. Rather, he gave voice to them during the 1912 New Nationalism campaign, when he was out of power and he was scrambling to catch up with a very popular movement. In words that TR drafted, the Progressive Platform pledged, and these were his words, and it appeared in the final platform, to protect the home life against the hazards of sickness, irregular employment, and old age through a system of insurance adopted to American use, a proposal for a full-blown welfare state adopted to American political conditions. Now, because America was so anti-statist, much more then than it is now, progressives felt they had to connect this full-blown welfare state to public opinion. And they were the first movement to celebrate national mass public opinion. And so the Progressive Party platform also advocated important political reforms, not just measures to strengthen representative government, such as the right of women to vote and direct election of senators, as important as those reforms were, but also reforms dedicated to what TR called pure democracy. That is, democracy purged of the impure influence of special interests. These measures included the universal use of the direct primary, which would be an attack on the convention system that denied TR the Republican nomination, the initiative, the recall of public officials, popular referenda on state courts when they declared a law unconstitutional. The focus was on state courts because that's where the most egregious decisions were. And then, perhaps most controversially of all, an easier method, a much more majoritarian method to amend the Constitution. This assault on constitutional obstacles to public opinion anticipate FDR's court-packing plan. And these measures continue to guide reformers. I think liberals and conservatives alike who carry on the progressive crusade to remove or lessen the constitutional distance between representatives and mass public opinion. Now, there was a lot of issues that divided the progressives at the convention in Chicago. Civil rights, whether or not the Progressive Party should take on the shame of Jim Crow. The question of whether trusts should be controlled by regulating them or by dismantling them. And foreign policy. These were especially nettlesome issues. But there was one party doctrine that unified the disparate strands of progressivism. Its advocacy of the rule of the people. And sensing that pure democracy was the glue that held together the movement that he sought to lead, Roosevelt made the cause of popular rule the centerpiece of his insurgent presidential campaign. As Roosevelt said in his Confession of Faith, the first essential of the progressive program is the right of the people to rule. This program was highly controversial, especially its plank calling for popular referenda on court decisions. But TR's campaign was even more controversial than the progressive platform. It championed unvarnished majoritarianism. Towards the end of September, he announced in a speech in Phoenix, Arizona, that he would go even further than the Progressive Party platform in promoting pure democracy, and in particular in promoting the recall of public officials. He would apply the recall to everybody, TR insisted, including the president. Now, wouldn't that be fun if we had that in American politics? Even the great commoner chokes me up. William Jennings Bryan, the famous populist, whom the progressives courted and actually tried to recruit as TR's running mate, blushed at this unvarnished defense of majoritarianism. Popular methods such as the recall, Bryan insisted, should not be nationalized. They should be confined to the states. Now, TR's defense of pure democracy, obviously, ladies and gentlemen, infused his campaign with deep constitutional significance. The progressive program, championed with such messianic fervor, seemed to challenge the very foundations of Republican democracy. As James Madison, when the Constitution was written, described the shape of American constitutional government. The idea underlying the U.S. Constitution that space-created institutional devices such as the separation of powers and federalism allowed representatives to govern competently and fairly. That the task of representatives was not to serve public opinion, but rather, as Madison said in his famous 10th Federalist paper, to refine and enlarge the public views. The task of the American Constitution, Madison argued, was to establish majority rule, but one that was compatible with the rights of minorities and the rights of individuals. Now, Madison's constitutional sobriety had not gone unchallenged prior to 1912. Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, and Abraham Lincoln all celebrated, as Jefferson put it, the people en masse. But these great reformers of the 19th century believed that public opinion should be filtered by political parties and the states. TR's progressivism threatened to sweep all intermediary institutions off the stage. It risked ushering in a cult of personality. Or as the progressive political scientist Charles Merriam candidly put it, a democratic Caesarism. Now, in the face of Roosevelt's powerful challenge to the prevailing doctrine and practices of representative government in the United States, the burden of defending constitutional sobriety fell most heavily on President Taft. Taft didn't take to this contest with TR easily. After all, Roosevelt had passed the progressive scepter to him in 1908. He was TR's heir apparent. And as a member of TR's cabinet, he was his Secretary of War. Taft had supported the pragmatic progressive program that TR had promoted while he was in office, when Roosevelt worked for moderate reform within existing constitutional boundaries and with the cooperation of the Republican Party. And yet Taft now found his own efforts to carry on that pragmatic tradition of reform, the object of scorn, the victim of TR's celebration of pure democracy. Opposed to TR's attack on the party convention, the courts, and the constitutional amendment process, Taft was publicly condemned as a conservative. And with the cresting of the progressive movement, that was a pejorative label that suggested, as Taft said fearfully, that he was an enemy of the people. Yet Taft eventually found honor in the charge of conservatism leveled against him. Even as TR's defense of direct democracy found great favor throughout the country, Taft, invoking Madison's 10th Federalist paper, the level of discourse was really high in this election, guys. It's hard to imagine. Invoking Madison, Taft resisted the attempt, as he put it, to tear down all the checks and balances of a well-adjusted, democratic, constitutional, representative government. Taft's defense of the Constitution included support for the right of property. He claimed that institutions like the Senate and the judiciary protected the right of property and therefore were an important defense of business that was the gospel to most Republicans, especially those in Congress. I'm about out of time, or I'm out of time. I'm good. All right. Just pull me off the stage when you have me out. I'm almost finished. Okay. In words that Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan might have echoed, in the 2012 presidential election. One thing about we political scientists is we go back and forth in time, and so I'm jumping from 1912 to 2012. These words of Taft would be echoed, or have been echoed by Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan. Taft scorned progressives for harboring an ambition to subject the economy and society to total state control, to creating a benevolent despotism that would destroy the motive furnished by the right of property for individual efforts that were necessary to establish the material prosperity that was so central to the pursuit of happiness in American politics. At the same time, even as he gave this fervent defense of the right of property and pointed out how the weakening of constitutional forms might threaten it, Taft wanted to take a higher road. He insisted that the Progressive Party's attack on representative government, indeed on the very idea of representation, called for a new, more elevated form of conservatism. The real usefulness of the Republican Party, Taft insisted, consisted in its conservative tendencies to preserve constitutional government. The most sacred duty, he continued, of true conservatives was to uphold the courts and judges, which were sanctified by President Taft as the heights of the Constitution. It was unthinkable, he told an audience in Boston, Massachusetts, that Roosevelt would seriously propose to have a plebiscite on questions involving the construction of the Constitution. Now, Taft, although he gave a pretty impressive defense of Constitution, his words fell, as he put it, on deaf ears. I felt, Taft wrote a friend, like a man crying in the wilderness. Despite Taft's indictment that the progressives threatened to trash the Constitution, despite the hope of TR's political enemies that such a bold campaign would kill him politically, it was not Roosevelt but Taft who suffered a humiliating defeat. As Harry pointed out, TR thrashed him in the primary contest. Even in his home state of Ohio, Taft lost to Roosevelt in the primary. And this was the first primary contest in American presidential politics, so these defeats were of great symbolic importance. Then in the general election, Taft only won 2 states, Utah and Vermont, and 23.2% of the popular vote. Never had an incumbent president lost so badly. As goes Utah, so goes Vermont. That became the creed of constitutional sobriety. In contrast, although the most radical proposals would never be implemented that he supported during this campaign, T.R.'s strong showing, he came in second to Wilson, as Harry pointed out, and his dominant presence in that campaign signaled the birth of a modern mass democracy in the United States, one that established the president, rather than political parties, as the leading instrument of American democracy. As T.R. beguilingly put it, the president came to be viewed as the steward of the public welfare. In fact, Woodrow Wilson, whose New Freedom campaign was much more sympathetic to the decentralized state parties than T.R.'s, felt compelled or saw the opportunity to govern as a new nationalist progressive, and in doing so began a transformation of the Democratic Party and American politics. With sympathy for Bryan's attack on the presidency, Wilson and the Democratic Party opposed the idea of a presidency-centered administrative state. In fact, the Democratic Party platform called for a constitutional amendment that would establish a presidential term, establish a one-term presidency. It will not surprise you guys who know something about Wilson that this was the first part of the Democratic platform that he dismissed, that he forgot about. Advanced by Woodrow Wilson, T.R.'s campaign became conventional wisdom by the time of Franklin Roosevelt, his second cousin, who codified and made part of the American fabric many features of the new nationalism campaign. And only with Ronald Reagan in 1980 were fundamental challenges posed to the progressive program that T.R. defended. And that now seems to be culminating with the campaign of Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan. So as Harry comes over to get rid of me, I just want to close with a saying of Mark Twain to enhance the importance of the 2012 campaign for you. History does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys.
Answer the question if you don't get back on time.
Professor Milkis, in your book, you write in his last speech in the 1912 campaign given at Carnegie Hall, Roosevelt felt compelled to defend himself and the progressives from one particular charge. It's a charge that resonates today. He said that the economic and social reforms of the progressives might be accused of creating a paternalistic government that would sap the spirit of American individual responsibility. And the question is so American that a century later we are still debating this. And what is it in either the American people or the American government that keeps this from being unanswered, that keeps people going and going on this issue, and to have it still remain with us in 2012?
That's a heck of a question. That calls for, I think, a whole other lecture, but don't worry, I won't give it. It's really hard to give a short answer to that question, but let me just say two things. One is, it is true that America is exceptional in its commitment to individualism and its concern about big government. And that concern with individualism particularly is connected to our desire to have a thriving commercial republic, to nurture what Herbert Hoover called in the 1928 campaign, rugged individualism. And for all the successes of progressivism, they have never really completely trumped this idea of individualism, and I think for the better. But what fascinates me about TR and then his second cousin FDR is the way they were able to go back to fundamentals in order to defend the expansion of government that would have the responsibility to protect individual men and women from the terrifying uncertainties of the marketplace and the exploitation of big business in places of employment. And TR talked about duty and responsibility, the Commonwealth, with great effectiveness. FDR fine-tuned this a little bit. He tweaked it. FDR always said his only political opponent was TR. You know, Alf Landon didn't cut it. Alf Landon won Maine and Vermont in 1936, and if he'd given one more speech, he probably would have lost Canada, given his grin. But TR defined the progressive cause as a new idea of rights, a redefinition of the social contract. And given the new conditions of the industrial age, made so dramatic by the Great Depression, it was necessary to expand our idea of rights so we could deal with the obvious fact that necessary men and women are not free men and women. So security became a new truth of American politics, not one that trumps this idea of rugged individualism, but one that challenges it very profoundly, particularly programmatically. Americans are still conservatives ideologically, I think. I think most Americans would say they're conservatives, but they're programmatic progressives. So something like Social Security has become a program at least as sacred as the Bill of Rights. We treat it as a right or as an entitlement, as it's sometimes called. And even Mitt Romney won't touch that third rail of American politics.
We have time for one more. Yes, sir. No, we have a microphone. Who's got the... Oh, we had somebody at the microphone. I apologize.
It's all right. I'm Dan Weinberg from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop here in Chicago. And you call this the most radical election. Well, perhaps...
By a major political figure.
There's an article... we at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop might think that the 1860 election was fairly radical. It stopped nationalization of slavery. That was the issue, and led to civil war. What ties, if any, intellectual ties, whatever, were there perhaps to Lincoln and his era? Did Teddy Roosevelt have to get right with Lincoln?
Boy, these two wonderful questions. Can I take these guys home with me? Y'all want to come back to Virginia with me and greet the storm that's waiting for me? Everybody in 1912 tried to get right with Lincoln, and TR particularly thought that his mission was to be the 20th century embodiment of the kind of reform that Lincoln represented. I think TR stood on the balcony of his house in New York and saw the body of Lincoln pass when it was taken, going back to Illinois, and he felt a very profound contact with Lincoln. And just as Lincoln fought against chattel slavery, so Roosevelt said his argument was against wage slavery. And wage slavery was just as denigrating of the dignity of the democratic individual defended by the Declaration of Independence as chattel slavery had been. In fact, it was much more widespread. It was not limited to 3 million people in the South. It spread throughout the American continent. Now, the reason why I think TR's was a little more radical is that Abraham Lincoln can go back to the Declaration of Independence and defend natural rights. And argue that slavery is against it. And so what you're trying to do really is get the southern governments in the South to eliminate slavery. And eventually that's forced on them by the 13th Amendment. You're rolling back a government tyranny. TR had to defend a programmatic right. He had to defend the idea of government-established rights in American politics. And that was an important departure from the natural rights understanding that had dominated American politics so long and was defended in the Lochner case.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Milkis.
Thank you, Mike.
By the way, I didn't mean to shortchange Professor Milkis' impressive biography. I'll introduce the speakers by referring to where they come from, the University of Virginia, in your case. But the biographies were available to you in the programs and in the mini versions of the programs. And I urge everyone to read them because these speakers are very, very impressive people. Our second speaker is Professor David Zarefsky of Northwestern University, here in Chicago, or in Evanston. Just before the end of his acceptance speech, at the end of the Progressive Party convention, after he spent some time reciting these ideals his new party believed in, for the Americans he hoped to lead again, Theodore Roosevelt said, "Now, friends, this is my confession of faith." And that's the name given to the speech today. But it was the curiously powerful words he uttered only a paragraph or two later, a paragraph or two at the very end of his confession of faith that are most remembered 100 years later. Professor Zarefsky will discuss the speech and its final words. Professor Zarefsky.
Thank you very much, Harry. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor for me to be with you this morning. The primary topic of my scholarship is not Theodore Roosevelt, but is the history of American political discourse, in which this speech, titled A Confession of Faith, normally does not play a very large role. It's not a speech that school children study, much less memorize. It, for the most part, does not have the stylistic flourishes and careful wording of the speeches of Abraham Lincoln, and yet it's a very consequential speech, one that is full of ideas. It was presented at the Progressive Party National Convention on August 6th of 1912. Strictly speaking, it is not an acceptance speech. Roosevelt had not yet been nominated, although it was quite clear that that was going to happen. It was a keynote speech. Roosevelt did return and speak again, accepting the nomination, the first time that a presidential candidate had shown up at the National Convention in order to do so. But when Roosevelt appeared on the stage to deliver this keynote speech, his appearance set off a 58-minute-long demonstration of support and enthusiasm before he ever began to speak. He spoke for 2 hours. I thought about asking how many of you had read this speech from start to finish. I won't do that, but I have an idea, and that may be in part why it is not usually canonized in the history of American oratory. He was stopped for applause 145 times during the speech, the biggest applause line being when he came out in the speech in favor of woman suffrage. What is most remembered about the speech is the closing line that's already been quoted: "We stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord." But the speech is actually full of ideas. It develops a case, an affirmative case for big government and for the political changes that were needed to bring that about. And it proceeds basically through 3 steps: a justification for a third party, what the third party stands for, and why people should take it seriously and give it their support. It's not primarily an attempt to persuade undecided voters. After all, Roosevelt is preaching to the converted. It's instead an attempt to reinforce and to celebrate. Now, in a two-party nation, a third party, in a sense, has to justify itself in order to be taken seriously. And we can imagine several possible justifications. The two major parties both evade the real issues. This was argued during the 1844 election until the Democrats nominated James K. Polk. The two parties have become irrelevant to changing times. The two parties are corrupt. They've fallen under evil influences. The two parties are not really very different. This would be the claim that would be made famously by George Wallace in 1968, claiming that there's not a dime's worth of difference between them. Roosevelt, in his Confession of Faith, incorporates elements of all of these justifications. He says near the beginning of the speech, "The old parties are husks with no real soul within either, divided on artificial lines, boss-ridden and privilege-controlled, each a jumble of incongruous elements, and neither daring to speak out wisely and fearlessly on the vital issues of the day." You see, in that sentence, he captures most of the different defenses for a third-party effort. And a little bit later, "Our fight is a fundamental fight against both of the old corrupt party machines, for both are under the dominion of the plunder league of the professional politicians who are controlled and sustained by the great beneficiaries of privilege and reaction." Now, we see in these opening words the beginnings of some additional themes. There's special vengeance directed against the Republican Party, which he had recently courted, and which, as Sid explained, had it nominated him, the course of history probably would have been very different. But there's also the beginning of a theme here that government is not the antagonist of the people, which had been a traditional theme going back to Jefferson, but is their agent. As Roosevelt said, this new movement is a movement which proposes to put at the service of all our people the collective power of the people through their governmental agencies, alike in the nation and in the several states. If President Clinton bookended the end of the 20th century by saying the era of big government is over, Theodore Roosevelt bookended the beginning of the century in calling deliberately for the creation of big government. Why? Because times have changed. He says the prime need today is to face the fact that we are now in a great economic evolution. And he suggests that unless we respond appropriately to it, we will make it revolution rather than evolution. The elements of the change are fairly simple to state. First, a shift from farming to industry. By 1912, the nation was about equally divided between the two. Second, a shift from small to large business that increased the power of industry and decreased the power of the individual. It was in order to redress that imbalance, to provide a countervailing power against big business, that Theodore Roosevelt argued for big government, not for its own sake, but in order to empower the people. And there was the closing of the frontier, which meant that there was no longer an obvious safety valve for individuals who had left behind by the growth of business. This set Roosevelt up to position his program as a change that is preservative rather than revolutionary. The characteristics of the new party were that its principles were national, not sectional. The national chiefs and the state leaders of the party were in accord, not in competition, and its common cause was human rights and government efficiency. It promoted the supremacy of the people. Now, it's a standard theme in American politics that politicians identify their cause with the people and their opponent's cause with the special interests. You sometimes have to wonder about who's characterized as a special interest, but no matter, this is a common theme. And Roosevelt strikes it too, but in his case, the common theme is not just a positioning of opposites, it is an underlying principle that is carried out in many of the programs that the party supports, such as the presidential primary, the direct election of senators, the initiative, the referendum, and the recall. And as Roosevelt would say in this speech, all I desire to do by securing more direct control of the government agents and agencies of the people is to give the people the chance to make their representatives really represent them whenever the government becomes misrepresentative instead of representative. He had come to this conclusion, he said, not from closet study or as a mere matter of theory. I have been forced to it by a long experience with the actual conditions of our political life, largely under the influence of special privilege in the business world. There have arisen castes of politicians who not only do not represent the people, but who make their bread and butter by thwarting the wishes of the people. And he cited as evidence his failure to secure the Republican nomination in spite of fairly clear evidence of strong popular support. And he drew an analogy from this episode to repeated actions of the Congress and the state legislatures, and then he took on the courts for the reasons that Sid Milkis has explained. Roosevelt in 1912 said, "We do not question the general honesty of the courts, but in applying to present-day social conditions, the general prohibitions that were intended originally as safeguards to the citizen against the arbitrary power of government in the hands of caste and privilege." And then this next phrase is one of the few really clever turns of phrase in the speech. These prohibitions have been turned by the courts from safeguards against political and social privilege to barriers against political and social justice. And he's referring, of course, to the Lochner decision and to its progeny. And this was the era that gave birth to the idea that corporations are people, my friends, as we were reminded earlier in the current campaign. Now, in attacking the courts, Roosevelt uses the language of emancipation. He's presenting what he's championing not as a power play, but as emancipation. Emancipating the courts from standing in the way of social justice. This sort of implies, well, you know, they didn't want to rule this way in these cases, but they had to do it. He's going to emancipate them from that, and emancipating the people from enforced submission to a doctrine that would subvert the Constitution. He proposes amending the Constitution to provide for overturning of court decisions. And he acknowledges that this is unpopular. In a preemptive move, he says, every upholder of the privileged will denounce this as socialism or anarchy. So he beats him to the punch. He says, you're going to denounce this as socialism or anarchy, terms that have been used in the past in response to efforts at social reform. But in reality, he says, this is a corrective to socialism and an antidote to anarchy. Well, he's now about 25% of the way through the speech. The vast majority of the rest of it is about economic issues, beginning with protections for wage workers and going on to sections dealing with farmers, with business, with the tariff, with the high cost of living, with currency reform, with conservation, and with economic development of Alaska. But his argument for justice for wage workers is fairly typical of the way he develops all of these sections. He says, as a people, we cannot afford to let any group of citizens or any individual citizen live or labor under conditions which are injurious to the common welfare. So the premise that he starts out with is that the common welfare, the public good, trumps the interests, the economic interests of any particular category or class. And it's from that premise that he reasons to the need for public policies and for protections of those who might fall into that condition. So industry must submit to regulation in the public interest because the public interest is the highest value. And he says further that under no industrial order, in no commonwealth, in no trade, and no establishment should industry be carried on under conditions inimical to the social welfare. So the social welfare, the public good, the common welfare, these terms are used interchangeably throughout the speech and posited by Roosevelt as his highest value. And he suggests that in the absence of regulation, we would have not a concern for those values, but a race to the bottom as profit and privilege became dominant. And so he defends a living wage, regulation of hours, safety regulations, prevention of manufacturing in tenements, prohibition of child labor, and regulation of the conditions under which women worked. He called for cooperation between government and the private sector, a movement toward income equality. He said there are too many who do not prosper enough, and of the few who prosper greatly, there are certainly some whose prosperity does not mean well for the country. He says that the major parties are following a plan already tested and found wanting of giving prosperity to the big men on top and trusting in their mercy to let something leak through to the mass of their countrymen below. He was one of the first to criticize what we today call trickle-down economics. He was not unwilling to look to examples from other nations. He frequently cited Germany, which was pioneering in social insurance and social welfare. He also cites England as a role model. He says we need controls to protect people from the effects of concentration and cooperation among big business. And he says the concern is protecting the rights of the people. Sometimes this can be done effectively at the state level. Sometimes it requires the national level. His commitment is to neither level of government per se, but to protecting the people's rights. And he suggests that regulation is better than prosecution for antitrust violations, taking a swipe at the Democrats. He believed that the progressive economic platform was feasible. He said, the progressive proposal is definite. It is practicable. We promise nothing that we cannot carry out. We promise nothing which will jeopardize honest business. And by weaving that set of arguments among the various topics that I have listed, he gets almost to the end of the speech. He then turns to international relations. On this, he is much more vague. He spends about 3% of the speech on that topic, and here's essentially what he says. In international affairs, this country should behave toward other nations exactly as an honorable private citizen behaves toward other private citizens. This anticipates, of course, Franklin Roosevelt's good neighbor policy. We should do no wrong to any nation, weak or strong, and we should submit to no wrong. Above all, we should never in any treaty make any promise which we do not intend in good faith to fulfill. The only specific international issue that he discusses in this speech is the question of fortification of the Panama Canal, which was then under construction. And now he gets to his final appeal, the part for which the speech is remembered, if it is remembered at all. He referred to it as a confession of faith, placing his faith in the party, placing his faith in its platform, and placing his faith in the ability of American people to recognize the benefits of both. He sees his program as a moral imperative as well as an economic imperative. And he cites again his own previous experience that he said gives him confidence in this program and our ability to carry it out, and activates his faith. And from this point on, the speech takes on a somewhat evangelical tone. Roosevelt acknowledges that he's spoken for a long time, and he defends the length of the speech because I want you to know just what my deepest convictions are on the great questions of today, so that if you choose to make me your standard bearer, you shall make your choice understanding exactly how I feel. And if after hearing me you think you ought to choose someone else, I shall loyally abide by your choice. That's, of course, a statement made in pretty great confidence of what their choice will be. He credits his convictions again to his experience, and he acknowledges his commitment to big government. He says, I believe in a larger use of the governmental power to help remedy industrial wrongs. Why? Because it has been borne in on me by actual experience that without the exercise of such power, many of the wrongs will go unremedied. He articulates, frankly, his theory of rhetoric, his theory of persuasion, that it's easier to go over the heads of business and government leaders and to appeal directly to the people themselves, a position that he had embryonically worked toward as president that would become known as the Rhetorical Presidency, and that would dominate much of the 20th century. And then there's a standard theme in campaign discourse, prediction of inevitable victory. Now, Roosevelt was not dreamy-eyed. He knew that he might not be victorious, but the cause, the progressive cause, would ultimately be victorious. He says, I hope we shall win. And I believe that if we can wake the people to what the fight really means, we shall win. But win or lose, we shall not falter. Whatever fate may at the moment overtake any of us, the movement itself will not stop. Our cause is based on the eternal principles of righteousness, and even though we who now lead may for the time fail, in the end the cause shall triumph. And then the only thing that's probably a more standard claim than that is that God is on our side. And he refers back to his closing line in the speech he gave at the Republican convention when he was unsuccessful at gaining the nomination. Now, I'm going to read to you what is the final sentence of the speech. And I emphasize this is all one sentence. Now to you men, who in your turn have come together to spend and be spent in the endless crusade against wrong, to you who face the future resolute and confident, to you who strive in a spirit of brotherhood for the betterment of our nation, to you who gird yourselves for this great new fight in the never-ending warfare for the good of humankind, I say in closing what in that speech I said in closing, we stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord. In some ways similar, this is in many ways very different from what we have come to know and understand as normal campaign oratory or convention speaking. The focus of the speech is entirely policy-oriented. It is not a biographical narrative, except when he refers in a very general way to past experience. The emphasis is on the public good, and not just as an abstraction, but as the animating principle that is referred to over and over again throughout the speech to justify the positions that Roosevelt advances. He emphasizes government as a good thing, where in recent years we've become familiar with politicians emphasizing their distance from government as a good thing. It's fairly specific in laying out the program of the Progressive Party, which is derived from a central premise of the need for countervailing power in the form of big government. It captures the insurgent spirit of the Bull Moose protest and it is spoken in behalf of the people. Thank you.
It was so interesting. I think if Theodore Roosevelt had spoken his thoughts that day in the abbreviated version you just gave us, more of us would have read the entire speech. Thank you, Professor Zarefsky.
Sure.
Don't go away. I see at least one question we have right over here. I recognize Dr. Kearney from Boston.
Gary Kearney, and a proud Northwestern graduate.
All right. Go Cats.
Your colleague at Northwestern, Gary Wills, has written that President Lincoln's Gettysburg Address contained the word that remade America. He means by this, and I hope I'm saying it right, that by implicitly bringing the Declaration of Independence with its pronouncement that all men are by their Creator with inalienable rights and natural rights that you spoke of earlier, that it is rights possessed not as a gift of government or any other human being, but those possessed simply because they are human beings, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And further, the purpose of government, indeed the reason for government, is that it is to secure those rights for the people by folding the Declaration of Independence and natural rights it enumerated into the Constitution. President Lincoln made the Declaration of Independence every bit as important and every bit equal to the Constitution in determining what rights the American people have and whether the Bill of Rights or whether in the Bill of Rights or not. In his Confession of Faith speech, Theodore Roosevelt said, "We progressives stand for the rights of the people," but he spoke almost entirely of economic rights. My question is, did Roosevelt seek in this acceptance speech to bring economic rights explicitly into the Constitution, much as Lincoln did for natural rights?
No. I think what Lincoln is trying to do is pretty much exactly as you have described, and in the process to reimagine the country as a nation rather than a confederation of states. And you've probably heard the statement that after this speech it became common to speak of the United States as a singular. The United States is, where before it had become common to speak of the United States in the plural. The United States are. So there's a difference in emphasis from state to nation. And Lincoln accomplishes that, I think, in exactly the way you describe. Now, I think what Theodore Roosevelt does is similar, but not quite the same thing. Like Lincoln, he is not proposing to formally amend the Constitution, but he is proposing to revise our understanding of rights and guarantees. The difference, I believe, is that unlike Lincoln, Roosevelt is not grounding his argument, at least as I read it, he is not grounding his argument in natural rights of the individual. He is grounding his argument in the realities of power and in the need for a countervailing power to neutralize and offset the power of big business. And he argues that the expansion of government, particularly in the economic realm, should accomplish that. But he grounds it in his assumption that the public interest is primary, that the common welfare is primary, that the social welfare is primary. These are not individualist economic rights in the same way that Lincoln is talking about individual rights. So I think there are similarities, but that fundamental difference.
Any other questions? I see one. Would you, Fritz, we need to get a microphone to you. Who has the mic?
I'm Fritz on that side.
We're coming to you.
Is it on? Is it on?
Yes.
Would social media been the tipping point to get his message out for a possible victory?
Could be. Roosevelt, of course, claimed, and probably correctly, that he had popular support. And had we been able to imagine a means of both condensation and rapid circulation of the confession of faith, I suspect it might well have taken hold more than it did in the immediate environment of 1912.
Thank you very much.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.